First, want to say that we are grateful to kick off the day with a keynote speaker from our Kat Calvin, who flew in all the way from Arizona. And we also have her colleague, Marissa Goldfaden, who will be supporting or help moderating a panel that will be happening later today. But I first want to say that we first kind of found out about Kat on a coalition call. She came in and spoke about really the impacts of ID access that we are seeing, not only in our states, but what does that mean collectively as a whole, as a country? And what she had to say and what she was saying, we knew that we needed to see how we can get her here in this room today to inspire us and give us a context of what ID access looks like here in our country in this day and age today. So Kat Calvin is the founder and executive director of Spread the Vote and Project ID, and the co-founder and CEO of Project ID Action Fund. And she is a leading person, a leading beacon in our country on ID access stuff, as well as how that impacts voting rights. And that is evident by how she has shown up in different spaces across the country, as well as in her book that she written and published that's called American Identity in Crisis, Notes from an Accident, Notes from an Accidental Activist. I'm just chopping up your entire book. So you can, you'll have a comeback. You'll have a comeback in your speaker, but which will be, of course, be available for purchase later today. So she will come and give us a history and the context of our country's ID crisis, the work that her and her team has done to try and combat that, and offer some guidance on what we can do here in Missouri to reduce the barriers and completely eliminate those barriers for people who are experiencing ID crisis every single day. So with that being said, let's go ahead and welcome Kat Calvin.
Even in person, we still have to deal with Zoom issues. Gotcha. Thank you. It's okay if I move this. Hi, everyone. First of all, the fact that we all made it here with this race situation, congratulations, the dedication already, I'm impressed. I'm so thrilled to be here because I'm pretty sure that this is the first ID summit that has ever happened in this country, and it's like my dream. I've been telling people who don't care all about it because I'm so thrilled about the fact that this is happening. You guys may not know it, but you're pioneers in a field that is critical to the future of this country, and especially to its most vulnerable citizens. But few people outside of this room even know that this problem exists. So in 1965, Ralph Nader, I never shut up about Ralph Nader, he wrote a book called Unsafe at Any Speed, because he realized, you know what, hey, maybe seatbelts are a good idea. It seems obvious now, but at the time it was a revelation, and it was a real battle to get car companies to comply with the most obvious safety features. But millions and millions of lives have been saved because of that fight, including mine and probably some of yours. In the same way, it's my dream that 20 years from now, it'll sound like a joke when we say, you know, there was once a time when 26 million American adults didn't have an ID. 26 million is the actual number. It's 11% of the adult population in this country. It sounds implausible, right? It can't be the number. When I'm in Congress and I say 26 million, they think I'm lying. I've been accused of lying. I have to pull out the study. It's 26 million American adults. If we think about all of the other major crises that we're constantly battling as a nation, we think about heart disease, which kills 695,000 people a year, or cancer, which kills 2 million. or the 117,000 people who are shot by guns every year in this country. These are the biggest issues of our day, and they don't come close to the number of people who can't get jobs, housing, healthcare, or basic services because we have the little plastic card that the rest of us keep in our wallets and hate because of those hideous pictures that I'm convinced is actually the real conspiracy that we should all be fighting. 26 million is a massive number. It's so massive that most people shut down when they hear it. But as my fellow ID workers, you know that each of those numbers is actually a person with a story. I think a lot about Rhonda, one of my clients from Los Angeles. Rhonda lived in a tent in Skid Row. Now, Skid Row is a common term for a depressed area and also a great song from Little Shop of Horrors. But in Los Angeles, it's a small country. It takes up between 25 to 50 blocks of downtown LA, depending on who you ask. And it's existed since the 30s. It houses at least 5,000 unhoused people, although that's according to the pit count, which you know is always wrong. It's the center of what we in LA call the homeless industrial complex, which is a conglomerate of public and private homeless services organizations that serve and try to help the 75,000, again, according to the pit count, unhoused residents of Los Angeles County. It's a massive, shocking number of people, and it's really easy to get lost, especially if you are Black, female, and deaf like Rhonda. It's never safe to be unhoused and female, and if you add a disability, the streets become unbearable. Rhonda had been through a lot, but she was kind and she was hopeful and she really wanted a home and a better life. She came to us to get her ID, but of course, as you know, she needed a birth certificate. And with no family, there was no one we could call, and we had to communicate using a notebook that she always carried with her. She begged us to help her quickly so she could get off the streets. She was in a tent in a very dangerous corner in the most dangerous part of town. So we sent in the paperwork and we waited. Of course, the waiting is the hardest part. Our clients are desperate for their IDs. Often it's the only thing keeping them from a bed or a roof or a check. And they want them now, of course, and it's heartbreaking to explain over and over that we have to wait for vital records to process their birth certificates. Some offices get them to us quickly, within days. There is notably a very small town in Utah that always mails them the same day. But some states take months and months and months. Looking at you, New York. Rhonda's was somewhere in the middle. We waited for weeks. I was worried about her every day. She came to see us every week to check in because she didn't have a phone or an email, so we couldn't contact her. She had to come to us. And every week I had to tell her that it wasn't in yet. And like so many of our clients, I could see her starting to steel herself for disappointment. The people we serve are so used to being let down that it's hard for them to let themselves hope just in case they'll be disappointed again. And I promised Rhonda that we'd get her birth certificate and that we wouldn't give up on her, but I could tell that she really didn't believe me. But she still came in every week, and one day, finally, she walked in and I pulled out her birth certificate. And she cried, I cried, I'm about to cry again. Everyone in the room cried. And her case manager had dropped her off that day, so we ran outside. We told her, case manager cried. We all headed to the DMV, and Rhonda got her ID. A few weeks later, Rhonda came running in. She had this huge smile on her face, and notably, she didn't have the several bags that she had always carried with her. She held up this lanyard that was around her neck. On it was her name, her building name, and her apartment number. Because she, with her new ID, had been given an apartment in this beautiful new building in this innovative new apartment center that was built for unhoused Angelenos. She was so thrilled, and so was I. This was one of those moments that made everything worth it. At Project ID, we have helped over 12,000 people get IDs. And every single time, we've experienced the joy of helping someone change their life. because that's what an ID is. It's not just a little card with a hideous photo and a note about what to do with your organs when you die. An ID is a key. It's a key to a home, it's a key to a job, it's a key to medical care, it's a key to a new life. I, like maybe many of you, discovered this key by accident. In 2016, after the presidential election, I decided I had to do something about voter ID laws. I had studied voting rights in law school way back when we had a fully functioning Voting Rights Act, which makes me sound really old, but I promise you, I'm very, very young. It's just that the laws have changed really quickly. So no one was worried when I graduated about voting rights. I mean, diehard liberal intellects and activists were on one side, and people who believed that the only way to reduce votes or to stay in power was to reduce votes on the other side were. But the rest of us were like, nah, we've got a law. We're good. There's a really good book called The Unsteady March, which lays out the history of civil rights in this country with this very simple thesis. Progress does not happen in a straight line or in a hockey stick projection. It's always 2 steps forward and 1 step back. We win, we lose, we win again, we lose twice, we win. Whether we're fighting for civil rights, for women, LGBTQ rights, whatever form of equality, you can look back through history. Christine just talked about it with trans rights. And you can see that we've never completely secured the rights that we've won. Look at Roe and then Dobbs. Every win is temporary when you don't fight to maintain them, even democracy. So we thought we were safe, and we weren't. And the 2016 election came around, and it turned out, hey, that new voter ID thing that no one was paying attention to, it kind of matters. And so although I had at that point sworn off ever starting another nonprofit again, I decided to go for it. I started Spread the Vote, and pretty much the second we launched, I realized we had made a terrible mistake. We were solely focused on voting, but when we tried to talk to people about getting IDs to vote, they said, I need a job. I need a safe place to sleep. I need to feed my kids. Can you help me get an ID for that? Oh. So I should explain that, like most of you, I've always had an ID. I got a passport when I was an infant. Literally, I have an old passport with little baby me. It's the only flattering ID photo I will ever have. Like most Army brats, I got a military ID when I was 10. I got a driver's license at 16, much to my single mother's relief, because now I was in charge of ferrying my little brother all over Seattle. Lucky me. But because of this gluttony of identification, I've never known a single conscious second of my life without having at least one and usually multiple forms of photo ID. So when I started this voter ID org, I thought it must be a small problem that was only really about voting. When I realized what was really going on, everything changed. We pivoted, we focused on getting people the IDs they need for life. And now, almost 8 years later, I know so much more about how we got here, about what life looks like without IDs, and how we can solve the problem, which, spoiler, we can. So how did we get here? How did we end up with 26 million adults in this country who don't have photo ID? The truth is, there's always been an ID issue in America. And it shouldn't be any surprise. Anytime the burden is on the people to do something, the most vulnerable will be left behind. You can see that with, say, voter registration. State IDs are actually a pretty new invention, early 20th century. They expanded across the US at that time as the mobility of Americans, particularly Black Americans, prompted policymakers to police and limit the movement of Black people. So they tracked them by including racial designations on IDs. So we ended up with a state-by-state licensing system with IDs that residents cannot take with them when they move across state lines, and that require 2 pieces of paper that we hand out in the maternity ward. When we're born, they say, hey, newborn baby, here's a paper birth certificate and a paper social security card. Please hold on to them forever. I know, you're a baby. You don't know where your toes are. You've never seen a single episode of Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and you can't make a martini. But if you don't still have these little pieces of paper in 40 years, you can't get a job or a house. Good luck. We once had a client in Virginia. She, of course, needed her ID, but she also needed her birth certificate and social security card. She'd had one, And even though she was in her 40s, her mother had just always kept them at her house until her mother passed away. And her aunt threw everything her mother owned, including all of our clients' documents, into the trash. But of course, it's not always rogue aunts. I can't count how many of our clients have lost their documents in hurricanes, tornadoes, fires, or just being human. I mean, let's face it, we're not the most organized species. But sure, let's give everyone the two most consequential pieces of paper of their lives before they're able to feed themselves. I mean, is it any wonder why 26 million people don't have IDs? So there's always been an ID issue, but it was much, much smaller. And then 9/11 happened. IDs were illegally procured and used on that day, and one of the quickest ways that we reacted was by making it much more difficult to get a government ID. This is where Real ID comes from. The 9/11 Commission created Real ID to make our state IDs safer and more difficult to procure. But obviously, 20 plus years later, we're still waiting for Real ID to be fully implemented. I was 17 when 9/11 happened. I am not 17 now. State DMVs, however, were not as slow to act. They quickly mobilized, and they not only made IDs much more secure, you would be amazed by the kind of security tech that's actually in your ID. They also made it much harder to get. But that is actually only part of the problem. The thing that makes you different, sitting here in this room, is that unlike the people who make the rules for who gets to have healthcare or get benefits or get a grant to provide food for the community, is that you know that people who most often need the help don't have IDs. The people who make the rules do not. So we end up in this crisis loop in which the people most in need of services are the very people who cannot attain them. But it's not on purpose. There are not a bunch of evil bureaucrats who are sitting in cubicles gleefully preventing veterans from getting health care or former foster youth from getting housing because they don't have IDs. This is not purposeful discrimination. These are the consequences of ignorance. No one knows that 26 million American adults don't have IDs, so no one considers them when they're making the rules. And that lack of knowledge has led to devastating consequences. When Project ID started working in West Virginia, we were approached by a shelter. They were not allowed to admit anyone who didn't have an ID. And this wasn't because the shelter wanted to keep people out, it was one of the requirements of their funding. So on a cold winter night, an elderly woman came to the door seeking a bed. She didn't have an ID, so the shelter staff were forced to send her away. She slept on the steps of the shelter that night, and in the morning they found her body. These are the consequences of ignorance. But you here are the solution. You're the solution in two ways. First, you're helping people get the IDs that will change their lives. And it's not easy work, believe me, I know. The challenges start with birth certificates. You've been there. Your client needs a birth certificate to get an ID, but what do they need to get a birth certificate? An ID. It's another catch-22. Every state and county has its own rules that often feel arbitrary for how a person can get a birth certificate without an ID. Sometimes it's a form that no one knows exists, or it requires a trip to the notary, which presents its own challenges. Sometimes you need a lawyer, or a pint of blood, or a spell from a warlock. And heaven forbid your client is elderly and was born at home and never got a birth certificate. Or like one of our clients who was born in the bathtub of a house on a cult commune. The process of getting a letter of no record in almost every state is so absurd that I'm pretty sure that it is sadistically on purpose. Once you do finally figure out all of the overly complicated requirements, the worst part starts. It's the waiting. Part of the challenge of waiting is that every state and county, like I said, takes a wildly different amount of time to mail out documents. The other challenge is that our clients are extremely mobile. I often say I wish I could tag our clients like penguins, so I always know where they are. Housing insecurity, job scarcity, encounters with the criminal justice system, and so many other factors play into why our clients are always on the move. The weeks and sometimes months in between the day we order a birth certificate and the day it arrives means that when you are sleeping on the streets or you don't know where your next meal is coming from, it's an eternity. It's not irregular for us to get a text from a client saying, hey, I've moved to another state. Can you please mail me my birth certificate? or for a client to suddenly show up after a year away because they were hospitalized or incarcerated. And of course, some never come back and never get in touch. The long stretch between the order and the arrival are terrifying for us and for them, but eventually the birth certificate arrives, all of the other necessary documents are collected, and we're off to get an ID. That's the first and the most direct and most personal way that you are the solution to this problem. The other is less immediate, but no less important. You spread the word. Every time you talk about your ID work, or you mention it at Thanksgiving, or you celebrate on social media, you're furthering the cause. We need more people to know that this is an issue so that we can solve the problem on a larger scale. All of our individual work is amazing. It's critical. There are people who desperately need IDs right now, and the more of them that we can help, the better. But we are not going to get 26 million IDs one by one. We have to aim higher. Unfortunately, we have to get into politics. I love the West Wing, but my experience in politics has shown me the real world is more like Veep. Democracy would work so much better if it was led by robots or wizards or women. As it is, we built a flawed system, but it is a system that can change lives. Now, you guys have already had major success in this area through the hard work and advocacy of the Missouri ID Access Coalition. You achieved a huge win for unhoused Missourians who need IDs. And these are the kinds of wins we need more of in every state. In 2022, our political arm, the Project ID Action Fund, worked with Rep. Sean Casten of Illinois and Missouri's very own Cori Bush to introduce the IDs for an Inclusive Democracy Act to Congress. The bill, when it is passed, will create a free and optional federal ID for all Americans. It will, in one swipe of President Harris's pen, and a few congressional votes, a committee, a bit of bureaucracy, eventually solve our nation's ID problem once and for all. It's a big deal and it's thrilling, but it will be a lot of work. The passage of this bill would be one of the most consequential and impactful pieces of legislation ever to make it through Congress. And not just for Americans without an ID. We are all tied together, and what happens to one of us happens to all of us. I think COVID really taught us this. When every breath you take can mean life or death for the person next to you, it's impossible not to think about what it means to live in a society. We did not perhaps learn this lesson as much as I had hoped, but it's impossible to ignore the obvious fact that all of our fates are tied together. This is true when it comes to our health. Disease may start in Skid Row, but it will spread to your gated community, no matter how tightly you lock the gates. But it's also true of our economy. Think about what it means when 11% of the adult population of a country cannot legally work. When we make policy arguments, we have to think about what the government cares about. And the government will care that 26 million people are not paying taxes. Governments have a lot of nifty ways of making national statistics look better than they really are. It's spin, but with dire consequences. One of them is the unemployment rate. The country's reported rate of unemployment is 4.3%, but our true unemployment rate is 24.5%. 1/4 of employable adults. That's a massive amount of tax money that is just sitting on the table. It's money for healthcare, education, social safety nets, golden toilets for the military. There's also money that the country wouldn't have to spend on unemployment, on housing and healthcare subsidies, and the extremely high costs of homelessness. And that's just for the adults. Think of all of the ways that children of the unemployed and the un-ID'd would cost the taxpayers less. Spending the relatively small amount of money on helping every un-ID'd American get an ID would net countless economic benefits for the nation and for the American taxpayer. And that's just taxes. People with jobs spend money on food, clothes, overpriced candles. Imagine what the economy would look like if even just 10% more people in this country had jobs. They'd also be able to take better care of their families, save for college, pay for their kids to play kids sports, which are way more expensive than they were in the 80s. And I don't understand what's up with that. They could even go on vacation. Not Disney. Nobody can afford Disney, but definitely a national park, which is the best thing we've ever done in this country. The only thing we've gotten perfectly right. So you're picking up what I'm putting down. There is a strong economic argument to be made for ensuring that every American has an ID. And politicians may not care about much, but they do care about running for re-election on a strong economy. They also care about recidivism. Even if you have never heard the term the homeless to prison pipeline, you have probably seen the effects. We've criminalized homelessness in this country, but we've also made it almost impossible for returning citizens to re-enter the community in a way that keeps them out of homelessness. People who have been incarcerated are 13 times more likely to experience homelessness than the general public, while people experiencing homelessness are vastly more likely to interact with the criminal justice system. And this isn't just a tragedy for people who are unhoused, it's also extremely expensive for taxpayers. In a study from Denver in 2016, one unhoused person had 24 contacts with the police in 90 days. It cost the taxpayer $4,000. That's over $16,000 a year. There are almost 7,000 unhoused people in Missouri, according to the last pit count. $16,000 per person is $112 million. Can you think of anything else that Missouri could possibly spend $112 million on? I'll give you a minute. Now, studies show that homelessness costs the United States an average of $35,000 a year per person. So let's supercharge your imagination. What could Missouri spend, I don't know, $245 million a year on? These are critical issues that cannot be ignored and can, in fact, significantly impact your policy arguments. IDs and birth certificates are expensive, but they're not $35,000 a year expensive. It is so obviously better for our economy and for our people to make sure that everyone has an ID that it feels like some sort of weird cosmic joke that Congress isn't just throwing them out of helicopters and on trains, dropping bags of IDs for everybody. Like, how is this something that we have to fight for? It's because for us, the implications are obvious. We do this work every day. We're on the ground. Many of us have lived experience. We know the power of an ID, but that isn't true for everyone, particularly the people in power. And that's why fighting for change is one of our biggest responsibilities. Project ID's #1 goal is to put ourselves out of business. And the team and I have decided that the next time we're working with puppies or robots or robot puppies, all we have to do first is get every American an ID. And we can do that by passing our bill. That is, however, easier said than done. I hate to tell you this, but Schoolhouse Rock lied to us. Getting a bill passed in Congress is so much more difficult than that singing bill with legs led us to believe. For one thing, this country is way too big and it has way too many representatives. Why can't we have 2 states and just 4 people to convince? Why is it 10 million? And then you add to that the committees and the opposition and the coalitions and all of the rest, and it's a hefty mountain to climb. It's a big one, but it's not impossible. I think about the moon landing a lot. Partially because landing on the moon was the pinnacle of human achievement, and we've pretty much gone downhill from there. But also because of how we did it. President Kennedy looked the country in the eye and he said, we are going to the moon, not because it is easy, but because it is hard. And in a time before cell phones, graphing calculators, or color TV, we did it. We built an actual spaceship and went to the actual moon. Or we hired Stanley Kubrick to fake it on a soundstage, depending on what you believe. Over the last several years, which admittedly have not been great for the world, most people have come to believe that we can't go to the moon anymore, both literally and figuratively. People think we're too divisive, that we lack imagination, and that we literally have astronauts stranded in space right now. So maybe we should stop dreaming. I don't believe that. Hopefully the astronauts will get home. But I also think we can still do big things. And in fact, I think we have to. I think the only way we save ourselves, save each other, and save the world is by thinking bigger. I think we can get every single person in this country an ID. And then I think we can get everyone affordable housing, and we can solve homelessness, and then we can save the whales. I have complete and utter faith in this country because I'm here in this room with people like you. People who are working every day to help the most vulnerable people in Missouri get this little plastic card that no one even knows they need. I believe we can accomplish big things because we're here at the first ever ID Summit, doing something no one's ever done before. Yeah. And I believe it because we don't actually need everyone for our movement to succeed. We only need 3.5%. In 2011, Erica Chenoweth and Maria J. Steffen released a remarkable book. I know, I give a lot of book recommendations and speeches, but it's because I like homework. The book was called Why Civil Resistance Works, and it completely changed our perception of how and why nonviolent protest works, and more importantly, for our purposes, how many people it takes. I always believed that a movement needs a majority of the population to succeed, even though the evidence in front of me proved the opposite. The majority of Americans were never on the side of the civil rights movement, the women's rights movement, definitely not the gay rights movement, or frankly, any other movement. People never are. Change is terrifying, and most people are happy to just sit back and watch what happens. But what Chenoweth and Steffen found was that once 3.5% of an entire population begin to actively participate in a movement, it can't help but succeed. Now, it's true they were specifically talking about nonviolent protest against entrenched authorities or occupations, but it's not a stretch to see that all of the great movements of our time succeeded wildly with a relatively small number of people. And if we need 3.5% of the population to solve a problem that impacts 11% of that same population, I don't know, I kind of like that math. In fact, to make that math even better, Project ID is launching a new incubator to help launch new ID organizations all over the country. We want to see an ID obtaining operation in every city and town in America, and we're putting our time and money into making that happen. Because we agree, we can do big things. We can pass a bill that creates a national ID, and we can solve the ID crisis once and for all, and we can do it pretty quickly. In 2020, Honduras launched an ambitious national biometric ID program in spite of the extraordinary challenges of both COVID and 2 hurricanes. They wanted to issue new biometric ID cards to every eligible citizen in the country in a short time frame. They deployed teams across the country, even sending teams into areas that can only be reached by boat or horseback. And they enrolled every eligible citizen in the program in 6 months. 6 months. Honduras has a GDP of $30 billion. The state of Missouri has an annual budget of $52 billion. So if Honduras can get an ID for every person in their country in 6 months, America most certainly can. I know we will win this fight. I know our movement will succeed. Every time I watch someone get their ID, when I see their eyes light up or I watch them burst into tears as they tell me all about the things they can do now, every time I hear someone say, I'm a person again, I'm more resolved than I was before. We have to do this. There is no reason that a veteran should be living in his car because he can't get the ID that would get him the housing and the benefits that he earned by fighting for this country. There is no reason a mother should be raising her children in a condemned home with no running water because she can't get the ID that would qualify her for affordable housing. There is no reason a young adult should be released from the foster system with no documents and immediately end up on the streets because they can't get a job. You know this, you do this work every day, and you give so much of yourself to change these lives because we have to. We can't do anything else. So we'll keep doing it. We'll get up every day and we'll order the birth certificates, and we'll get the proofs of residency, and we'll go to the DMV, the unhappiest place on earth. And we'll do it over and over and over again until every person in this country has an ID. But we will also call our members of Congress, we'll call our state representatives, we'll write letters to the governor, and we'll hound city council at every single town meeting until we change the laws and make it a matter of policy in this country that every single American has the right and the ability to attain an ID until we no longer have an ID crisis. Until it's a funny joke about there was a time when cars didn't have seatbelts and people didn't have IDs. How weird is that? Also, dinosaurs walked the earth and people slept on waterbeds. Can you believe it? Although I really liked my waterbed, even with the occasional leak, right? Bring back waterbeds. That's my next thing. We can do big things, and we will. We've already started. Today is one more day to build the movement. And we'll all be together when we celebrate that every American has an ID and we're all newly unemployed and we're looking for a new cause to fight for. And I am so grateful to be in this fight with you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kat. One more round of applause. Sarah and I are going to grab mics for Q&A. We do ask that you wait for us to come to you with the mic so that everyone can hear your question.
I have two quick questions.
Yes, ma'am.
What is a letter of no record, meaning there's no record of their birth certificate?
So yeah, it means that the state can't find any record that they ever had a birth certificate, which happens if you're born in the bathtub of a cult, or if you're elderly and you were born in rural areas, or if you're elderly and Black and you were born in a town where they didn't give Black children birth certificates. And then each state has wildly unreasonable rules for how to get a letter of no record. We had a gentleman who was in his 90s, and the state said we had to get the preacher who baptized him to write an affidavit. And unless he's a vampire, that wasn't going to happen. But yes, it's a way, and most DMVs will accept a letter of no record of saying this person has a birth certificate, but they're almost impossible to get.
And what was the name of the bill that with Cori Bush?
Oh, so our bill is the IDs for an Inclusive Democracy Act. You can go to id4id.org. Then it's our website that we have all about the bill and how you can get involved. id4id.org.
We'll make sure that you have that in the follow-up email.
Perfect.
So talking about that, what is the progress on the bill? And I guess what's your action steps looking like?
Well, a lot of it depends on this election. So we've got good movement in Congress on the bill, a lot of really good sponsors. The committee it's on includes Marjorie Taylor Greene and Lauren Boebert, so it's not moving forward there. And so we, we'll find out in November what the new Congress looks like, and then that will help us figure out what our action steps will be for next year.
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
Some of the stats that you cited, like cost and stuff for the in-house, is that on your website, or do you have a good place where we can access some of that
they're in my book.
Oh, in your book.
They're in my book, which you can get
book.
at 4:15 p.m. And I'll even sign it for you. There it is. It's pink. How do you not want to buy? I told them no red, white, and blue. I want a pink book. I want it to be fun and friendly and like book club acceptable. I want it to look good next to a mimosa. That was my goal with the book. So yes, that's actually our website, they sort of different things in different places. But the book, and my email is kat@projectid.org. So if there's anything specific that you want a site or a study for, there's a really excellent, the Movement Access Project came out with what I think is the most comprehensive ID study in, Marissa, was that 22, 23 that they came out with that? Yeah, maybe last year, which is a really incredible sort of updated and really first ID study that doesn't specifically have to do with voting, which gave us the 26 million number and some other things. So I will include that study. I'll give it to the ladies to put in the follow-up email, but you can also email me for any other stats that you want.
Yeah, we'll include it in the follow-up email. And the info sheets out there are from the Movement Advancement Project map. And there, someone who is really involved in the study is actually a Missourian. So
Yes.
exciting
I'm
too.
telling you, you'd have no idea how far ahead of the curve you are. Trailblazers, all of you.
Hi, thank you so much. I wanted to say, I love Mount Holyoke College. I went to Hampshire.
Oh, Hampshire
was
Halloween
first
was
a-
always the best time of the year.
My question has to do with this real ID,
Mhm.
and you said you mentioned it, and is it yet another way for the state to make it even more difficult to get an ID, or what is it all about?
Yeah, it's a way for the federal government to make it more difficult. So what happened in 9/11 is that I believe there were 19 9/11 terrorists, and they had 26 different state IDs that they got kind of legally, right? Because it used to be, if you remember back in the day, if you moved from one state to the other, you just showed them your old state ID and they just gave you another one. And it was pretty easy. And so they just went to multiple states and got multiple IDs. And so because that was such a critical piece of how they were able to perpetrate that crime, the 9/11 Commission said, all right, we've got to make it a lot more difficult, because we did the very human thing of saying, oh, we're going to react defensively in the most extreme way possible and not think about how it impacts the most vulnerable people, because who cares? And so, what it does, and part of the reason that people, well, first of all, the reason that it has taken this long is because the states revolted and we're like, this is expensive. It's a big change. The 9/11 Commission wanted it done in like 2 years or something. And they were like, absolutely not. There were all of these lawsuits. So that's why now 2025, there's a real joke in the ID community that real ID is never going to happen. Now it's May of 2025. We'll see if that actually sticks. But it seems like a small addition, because in most places it's just, adding an extra proof of residency that you need, except we all know that getting one more proof of residency is life or death for most of our clients. Like, it's hard enough just getting the ones you can get. And so there's a real battle there, but yes, it's entirely intended to make it more difficult to get IDs because of 9/11.
Thank you for your remarks this morning. Actually, you're making me think of my own real ID quest, which I won't detail, but as an organized person with every document in the world, even I had to go back twice because the person across the desk wasn't that interested in what I brought, even though it fit. Anyway, there's a lot of variability in how the staff.
Yes.
My question
100%.
though goes to, as I'm thinking about the bill that you're talking about, I go to where all the arguments we're going to hear and all the buts we're going to hear. So my question would be, as the coalition advocates for the bill, a national ID, who's doing the work to think about, for example, if we had more of our military veterans have the IDs they need to access the services to which they have a right, who's detailing the cost and putting that all together so that that doesn't get thrown at us and we're like, whoa, because we could justify, it doesn't matter how much it costs, we should still do it, but how much is it really going to cost? That's one example.
Yeah, so the people who do that for a bill are generally GAO, which is the Government Accountability Office. And so what happens is the member of Congress, so the lead sponsor is Sean Casten out of Illinois, my favorite person, is that as we're working towards a bill and finding the arguments, I can tell you sort of what the arguments are on both sides, that we commission studies. The GAO just recently came out with an ID study. They should have asked me because they missed a lot. So going back, I have words for the GAO. But we do both, it's all commissioned sort of through Congress, so that it comes from the government offices, so that then we can take it to other members of Congress and say, look, this is what our internal offices have said. So that's generally the answer. So as we move forward, and there's some things that we move forward on, some things because of the state of Congress in the last year, it's been like, well, we can't really move forward with anything. So there'll be other things that post-election we can see, sort of what we move forward, but that's where we get those costs and those numbers from, is those internal offices. The arguments we get on both sides. So when we wrote this bill, I was very adamant that the word vote would not be anywhere in this bill, because that would be the immediate killer. We are pushing this as a jobs bill because that is what it is. And that is a thing that works on both sides. And as long as we push any of these policies as jobs and economic policies, both sides are really big on them. Second, you bring out vote, you lose everyone on the right and you lose, honestly, a third of the people on the left. And so if we keep that out, we actually don't get a ton of arguments from the right. The arguments we get from the far left are, well, if we had a federal ID, the federal government could track us, to which I say, where have you been? They know what you had for breakfast and what you weighed before and after breakfast this morning. The government can track you. One thing that has really helped with that is COVID, because the government, without asking you a single question, was able to figure out exactly to the dime how much money they should send you based on your income and how many children you have and everything else. And a check just showed up, or just showed up in your bank account, because they even know your bank account number, right? And so being able to go to all of the people who sort of cry, this will lead to some sort of like government tracking program. Say, did you get a check? Because I spent all of mine on wine and I didn't have to tell the government anything. And that's been really helpful for helping people realize, oh, right, they can track us. Another thing that actually Real ID has been really helpful for is that there has been a real argument on both sides when this comes up of like, well, we don't want to get rid of state autonomy. But the federal government proved that they did that when they made every single state comply with Real ID, right? Like, and have proof. It's the federal government. We can argue states' rights all we want, but they can make you do something if they want to. And so the arguments honestly haven't been the biggest challenge. The biggest challenge is getting people to really understand the 26 million number, and B, like the number for each state, and we can go in and say, well, you represent this district. And we don't have studies that break down by district, but we generally can sort of pull an algorithm and know sort of what the numbers are for what impact people. It's also that no one thinks that poor and homeless people are voters, so they don't really care, right? If this was, we're trying to get the AARP on board because that'll help, because seniors vote. But it's really getting people to care about this population, because if politicians did care, we wouldn't have this problem. It affects 26 million people. It's just the 26 million people they don't care about. So it's less that there's a specific policy argument on either side, and more of a, we need to get you to understand this issue and actually care about it. One thing that's been exciting is that there are other ID bills that are being introduced by other members of Congress. So I just spoke to a senator last week because they are introducing a bill that would require federal prisons to issue an ID to every single person who leaves a federal prison, and to actually create mobile ID programs with the DMVs in their states. There are several different ID bills that people are starting to come out with. The incarceration argument is another big one, because recidivism just reduces like crazy if people have an ID when they are let out of incarceration. And so those bills that pop up, I get called regularly now from sort of people in Congress who are like, hey, we're thinking about a bill about this ID or about that. That is making sort of people realize more and more that this is an issue, which is really exciting for our bill moving forward.
My question goes back to, you referred to biometric ID cards that the Honduras did.
Yes.
So what exactly is the biometrics that they used? And that leads to a bigger question, is why are we still hanging on to little paper and plastic cards in this day and age?
Look, Marissa and I devolved into a fit of giggles, angry giggles this morning, because the idea that we still give infants 2 pieces of paper and are like, hold on for this for the rest of your life or you're screwed, is why, like, it's insane. So I don't know, because people are just slow on change, and honestly, it's because it's easy for most people, right? The remarkable thing isn't that 11% of the adult population in this country doesn't have an ID. The remarkable thing is that 89% do. Like, we all go to the DMV and have the paperwork and get that's an insane thing. The fact that we all get these pieces of paper as babies and most of us are able to hold on to them is mind-blowing, right? Like, that's what's crazy. And so because so many of us are able to do that, we just don't think about it. We're really segregated by socioeconomic status in this country and by ID status. So whenever I'm speaking to a room of people, I'm speaking to a room of people who either have IDs, or I'm working with a room of people who don't. But we don't mix. Lawyers and unhoused people don't go to dinner together, right? And so we are only around people who have the same experience. No member of Congress doesn't have an ID. And not many, it's probably what Cory Bush is the only member of Congress who really has any experience with being unhoused, right? Like, it's just not, it's a privilege is so separate, and we're so segregated that we don't think about it. As for what biometrics, I have absolutely no idea. The UN has had a program for a little while of trying to help developed countries be able to biometrically ID their populations. Yeah, I have no idea all of that of what's included in there because I'm just trying to get us a regular ID. Biometric IDs are like 30 years in the future. But you can definitely look into it because there's a whole UN program.
I'm thinking about the like ID access in terms of the relationships where you're trying to build relationships and hold accountable like state entities like the Department of Revenue or the Department of Corrections. What have been some of your experiences or best practices navigating those kind of group relationships where you're wanting to build good rapport, but also you're wanting to hold them accountable for what they're not doing or is being done incorrectly? Or
yeah, so one of the key things is finding a champion within the organization. You know, is there, and this works too with when you're trying to change policy, like find one staffer, because the truth about politicians is they don't actually do anything. Their staffers do everything and they don't know anything. They just read memos that their staffers give them. And if you introduce a bill, it's 100% your responsibility to move it forward. They're gonna ask you before they go speak, what am I talking about again? Right, like, so like, you know, it's finding that one champion, it's finding the person. So we have a program in Michigan that we set up where, so the ID issuing entity in Michigan is the Secretary of State. Every state has different names. In Florida, it's the tax collector. Like, come on. I honestly thought people were joking when they first told me that. In Michigan, it's the Secretary of State's office. And so we built a relationship, and this took, I can't tell you how long, and luckily we have a brilliant Justice Services director who is more patient than I am, where the Secretary of State's office goes most quarterly or sort of whatever works for them, takes a mobile unit into county jails in some prisons and gets IDs for everyone who's going to be released within that period of time, quarterly or whatever. And then hilariously bills us because the state's getting the state a thing, so I should pay for it from my bedroom. But you know, that took a really long time to set up. The reason we were able to is because we found a person in the Secretary of State's office who was really passionate about this issue. And we had relationships. We run a national program called Vote by Mail in Jail, in which we help incarcerated citizens vote in jails across the country. We're in the only national incarcerated jail program. And so through that, we've been able to build relationships with jails, which we then try to use to help get IDs. And then we were able to find like the jails that were really passionate about it, found like 2, had them pilot the program. They realized, oh, this really works, and then wanted to expand it, particularly because it's practically free for them. But it's the time that it takes to sort of have the meetings, find a person who actually gets it, who actually cares, either because they have lived experience or because once you explain it, they're like, oh my God, yeah, that totally makes sense. And then being able to help that person figure out, okay, who do you have to convince? Oh, your boss, and they really care about X thing. Okay, we can give you a 1-pager that specifically talks about how this affects foster youth because that's what they really care about, right? Or okay, we can break down like the costs and how much this would cost versus how much it would save them on the other side or whatever, and helping them figure out what are the arguments that they need. We're always here to be a resource if you need this kind of information, if you need help with this kind of thing, putting things together, finding the data, finding the case studies. We're working with the Access Coalition. We've been finding, Missouri is a wild state. But like finding like really cool stuff. But like it's the find the champion and then empower the champion, because for the most part, in most places, it is much easier to make change from within than from knocking on the gates. And so if you can just be the person who is like that Trojan horse who's funneling the information to the person within, then that really helps you get started.
It looks like we just have time for 1 or 2 more questions. So I'm going to pass it to Helen here.
When are you going to run for political office?
Never. Never. So my grandmother she's still alive, but she's 93 now. She just watches MSNBC and Matlock. But she was really, really civically active, and I'm very engaged. And people were always asking her to run for mayor. They said, Grandma, why don't you run for mayor? And she said, because when you get an elected office, you lose all your power. And I think that that's true. And it's, you know, one of the opportunities of not being in power, right, is you get to choose one subject and fight for it, right? Like I can just fight for IDs and like really care about it. So I'm gonna get an ID bill and I'm gonna do all these things. When you are a person who's not, you have to care about everything. You have to care about IDs and food insecurity and nuclear nonproliferation and calling 12 donors a day and like all these things. And it's really exhausting. And I think you get less done. So never. But thank you.
All right. Well, I do have another question.
Yes,
and
ma'am.
it's something that just surprised me was that you have to pay for your birth certificate.
A lot.
A lot.
Yes.
So is that, are all states?
Yes. So
requiring-
all states, and they vary. So in California, if you can get the form and figure out the wildly complicated process, then if you are in house, you can get a free birth certificate. We got a bill through the state legislature, through both houses, in California that would give free birth certificates to low-income Californians, and we have free IDs for the unhoused in California, but not free driver's licenses, which cost $41, and free driver's licenses for the unhoused. It was vetoed by Gavin Newsom. And one of the big reasons is that the DMV and the county clerks really fought it because they said, oh, we're so broke. Let me tell you something about the DMV. They are never going to go bankrupt. But they cried broke and they really fought it because the idea of giving away more things for free was really, really appalling to them. And that's really one of the biggest problems when we're fighting for these free documents across the country, is that the state entities even that would have to give them for free really don't want to have to deal with that loss of their budget. And so they fight for it. And even though on the state level, and the reason we got it through the legislature is that the legislators understood, well, this saves the state a ton of, like the amount of money we're spending on homelessness. Yeah, we'll pay the $30 for a birth certificate, which doesn't cost $30. They print it right there. It costs 25 cents, right? And that for the state, it makes more money. But for the county clerks, it loses them money because they're the one who are making the $29.75 on that piece of paper. And so, yeah, it's the same in every state, and the costs vary. And then, Vital Check, the number of times I spent $90 on a birth certificate from New Jersey, because they add $1 million. That's, if you ever want to learn about Marissa's pet peeve, just go up to her and say Vital Check and you'll get her a drink. You'll hear about it forever. But yeah, every state charges. Some have rules, like Pennsylvania, there's a great form. I can send it to you. You mail it off if someone's unhoused. They mail back a free birth certificate in 3 weeks. It's amazing. There are some states that have things like that, but all of that we've learned through Marissa calling every state multiple times to find out, oh, you do have a form, or reading the legislation and then telling the county clerk about the legislation and say, no, you do have a form. Where is it? Because it's right here. We have the bill. Because it's really difficult to find, but yeah, we charge for everything.
So we have one more question and we're at time. So maybe we're going to plant it and we're going to have a quick response, but maybe
I'll have a very quick response
into our break after this. So go ahead.
Yeah, just based on what Christine was talking about this morning, I'm wondering for the federal bill, what securities there are for trans and non-binary folks in regards to gender markers and name changes.
Oh, well, I can tell you this. So what we decided very early on, the thing we don't want Congress debating on is what documents are required for anything. So what the bill does, it is a very simple bill. It says, hey, give us the money in a committee and we'll decide all of that. And so we're just asking Congress to say yes to a federal ID and yes to the money, and then yes to setting up a committee of experts who will decide all of the documents so that we don't have those arguments on the floor of the House and Senate.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Off to your break. Thank you.